Welcome to episode 2 of Entering the Void, our interview series with Dr. Yvette De Villiers, a holistic well-being consultant with a PhD in metaphysical philosophy. My name is Mark Bind from Moyo Talks, and we are doing this interview live in our studio in Cape Town, South Africa. Yvette, we've spoken a lot about the photon belt. Perhaps you can start off this episode by explaining to us what a photon actually is.
Yes, Mark, a photon is known as the smallest subatomic particle of electromagnetic radiation known to man.
Okay, and what does a photon actually do?
So a photon influences the energy within matter. So what that means is that when the electromagnetic energy within matter collides with photons and absorbs the radiation of the photons, then that amplifies and intensifies the properties of those electromagnetic particles. And those properties are anywhere on a range from complete incoherence to coherence. And just to stand still at that, if you can remember in our interview, we spoke about the experiments that Masaru Emoto did with the water crystals. In other words, when he put coherent sound waves through water, froze the water, and then looked at those ice crystals under a microscope, their structures were coherent. Okay, so they were geometrically sound and coherent. When he put discordant sounds through water, froze the water and looked at the crystals, those structures were incoherent. And this becomes quite important later on when we talk about the nature of our consciousness and it inhabiting matter.
Okay, and how is this going to impact us as we move into this photon belt? And perhaps you can actually just explain once again what the photon belt actually is.
So the photon belt is a field of energy that is particularly dense in photons, so in the subatomic particles of electromagnetic radiation. They have a high oscillation frequency. So if you can remember when we spoke about oscillation frequency, we spoke about the time-space and the space-time, which is the two parts of our reality, and how these subatomic particles of matter move through from space-time to time-space and back again, classically at 7.8 times per second for an inanimate object, so something that's not alive. So photon radiation, little photons actually move much faster than that. And if their mass and their oscillation frequency is higher than the energy currently in matter, that energy takes on the properties of the photons. And that means that interaction between the electromagnetic force in matter at the moment and photons will increase the intensity and will amplify those properties of coherence and incoherence. So the photon belt is a belt of energy that lies in space and that gets denser and denser the deeper you go into it. And we classically take, as a solar system, 2,000 years to travel through the belt. So at the edges of the belt, the mass, so the mass is the amount of photons and how tightly they are packed together. And the oscillation frequency is how fast they move through time-space to space-time and back. And it starts at the edges being sort of low, but then as we move deeper and deeper into the photon belt, it increases and intensifies. And because of that, it also increases and intensifies the properties of matter.
Okay, and so we are a decade or two into this photon belt of perhaps a 2,000-year journey.
That is correct. And we are already seeing the difference. And one of the big ways in which we see it is how light refracts differently around us. And I've brought along some very beautiful footage, some photographs that I've taken myself, where you can firstly see the light spectrum breaking down differently, so you can see that in a rainbow, where you can clearly see a 3D refraction of the light with the different wavelengths of the different colors. Then you see sunlight coming through our atmosphere in a more and more orb-like quality. I've got one of those where you can see an orb around the sun, and then I have another photograph where I was photographing somebody with a sunset in the background. To the naked eye, it looks normal, but once you look at the photograph, there's actually an orb forming inside the photograph.
I know you mentioned that before, and I saw a double rainbow over Rondebosch Common a couple of weeks ago, and
Yes.
you know, knowing what you had said about this, I noticed the colors were so much more vibrant.
That's correct.
Some people have also mentioned that the sun or sunlight appears lighter than it did when we were children.
That is correct as well. So light appears brighter, or appears to be brighter, because the oscillation frequency within the particles of the photon radiation that moves through that light is higher.
So what is the practical implication of this going forward?
So it will have three impacts. The first, and I'm just going to break them down just for sort of keeping track of what we're talking about. So firstly, it's an impact on our environment. Secondly, it's an impact on our interpersonal relationships and our experience thereof. And thirdly, it's an impact on ourselves and the way that we experience our environment. So if we look at the first one, there's this light refraction that is different in the environment, and which we'll see examples of in the photographs that I've brought here. The second one is weather pattern influencing. So definitely an increase in what we call superstorms and extreme weather, like the snow that we've just had in Texas now, in the American winter, which is unusual. The whole solar system is currently going through climate change.
So is this because these photons are hitting the energy of the planet, and it's causing the energy of the planet to be amplified?
That is correct. So if you think of a thunderstorm, and you think of what causes the thunder inside the thunderstorm, so those little collisions that are happening. So the oscillation frequency of the subatomic particles in those particles are speeding up. And so the weather is more intense, the thunder is more intense. This is not to be confused with pollution. You know, our greenhouse gas emissions are too high. It's threatening the heating of our oceans, which can create mass flooding with the melting of the polar caps. This is all real. But what the photon radiation does is it speeds up and intensifies those effects.
So is there an influence on the collective consciousness on the extreme weather that we're seeing?
Mark, yes and no. I personally believe that there is. We'll get into that in podcast number 4, where we're going to speak about the laws of attraction and manifestation. So I don't want to get ahead of ourselves there. No. What I want to get back to is 2 other ways in which we are currently seeing photon radiation affecting our environment. The second one that I want to mention here is cause and effect. And one of the very poignant and very relevant places where we're seeing that is we're seeing a definite increase in viral mutation. So viral mutation happens when resistance is encountered. So like anything else, a little virus wants to live, and when it encounters resistance, it finds new ways of manifesting itself through mutation in order to survive. And we're seeing a definite increase in that. And what that means for us as humans is that we are having an increase of the rate at which zoonotic transferal happens. So zoonotic transferal is when it's a virus that classically only comes manifests in animals, jumps over into a human. And if you go and look at the graphs, then you'll see that the rate at which this is happening is actually on the increase. There was a new swine flu that was seen to transfer to humans in July last year in China. And then most recently there is a new bird flu, H5N8, that has just been noticed in Russia on poultry farms to also transfer to humans.
Yeah, I did see that in the news. And I suppose because we are breeding animals to eat, we're living in close proximity, or portions of our population are living in very close proximity to these animals.
Yes, and unfortunately your hygiene practices there are not optimal. But this is not the only reason. It's also because of this increase of cause and effect. So there's an intensification of the rate at which viruses mutate. And the third way in which we see the effect in the environment is that it speeds up our experience of time. Now, you've heard a lot, or you could have heard about the Schumann resonance getting faster. This is actually a measure of lightning or particles from outer space hitting Earth's atmosphere, and the pulsation that happens there at 7.8 hertz. That is not actually true. That is not getting faster, and we are also not traveling around the sun faster as a planet. What is actually happening is the effect of the oscillation frequency in the subatomic particles of our matter is causing us to feel like things are happening faster. And that is this whole idea that you have of time speeding up. So it's a real experience, although it is not physics-wise real. And I think it's very important for me to make these distinctions, because we try to narrow the gap between metaphysical assumptions and mythology and what's actually going on around us. And that is quite important for me to stay focused on.
Yeah. Okay.
So the next area in which we are seeing this effect of this photon radiation is in our interpersonal relationships. Okay. And one of the ways in which we see it very clearly is that the way we experience our experiences are becoming amplified. And we can go into the details of it, but just to give you an idea there, so the experience of our experiences is amplified. And this is why it's so important to learn not to take what others do and say personally and react on it. Okay. There's also a polarization of resonance that starts to go on, or is going on. And that is the law of like attracts like. So you'll find that people would want to spend time with and be around other people who think like them and live like them. But then there is also the risk of polarizing or rejecting people who don't think like them and live like them.
And we see this on social media
Exactly.
quite acutely. People join groups, they like pages, they follow people who repeat the same beliefs that they already have. And it leads to polarization of people on social media, at least.
Well, this is the thing, Mark, because the polarization in itself is unavoidable, but the tolerance for them not villainizing or openly rejecting or going into conflict with people who do not think like you, that is a choice.
Yeah.
And with this amplification that's happening and this intensification of everything that we're experiencing, that is why it's so important, because otherwise we are also amplifying conflict. And this is what we're trying to stay away from.
Yeah.
The third thing that happens is that it heightens our experience of what we like and don't like in other people. So within relationships, our experience of what we are resonating with our partner with will be heightened. But when there is a disagreement or we see things differently, that will also be heightened.
Okay, so people could have a heightened experience of conflict in all of these things. It intensifies our experience of our experiences. Like attracts like, that we discussed, and heightening our experience of what we like and enjoy. All of that could lead to a heightened experience of conflict with the people around us.
If we are not mindful. And this is sort of edging towards, we're going to speak more intensely about this in our next podcast, when we speak about the self. Because we're going to unpack a little bit there why it's difficult not to take things in relationships personally, and why we tend to steer towards conflict when we are in disagreement. So we'll get into that in our next podcast. But for now, what I'm trying to highlight is that it is becoming more and more important for us as we move deeper into the photon belt, and we've got more and more of this radiation hitting us of the photon energy, to be mindful of the way that we think and feel about those around us.
And then the third area that you mentioned was the impact on ourselves.
That is correct. So the way we experience our world becomes our world, or the way we experience our experience becomes our experience. And what that is about is the fact that photon energy reacts with the energy within matter. So the energy within matter is our consciousness, and the matter is our physical body. So where our consciousness is at, so in other words, where our mind is at, is going to have a direct influence more and more on the way we experience our world. So if we constantly think that life is tough, then that is going to amplify and intensify our suffering.
And we'll have an experience of a tough life.
We'll have an experience of a tough life, but more so than we might have had before. Can you see that polarization? So that amplification and the intensification that the radiation from the photon belt has as an effect on us literally amplifies a thought. So if that thought is a positive or even a neutral thought, you know, where we're having a difficult day and we're just thinking, you know, it is what it is, let me work with acceptance, let me find the good, then that's going to be amplified and we're going to be more tolerant of our experience. But if we go into its opposite by entertaining negative thinking and pessimistic thought patterns, then our experience is also going to be amplified towards the negative.
So what you're saying is we are going to be manifesting our conscious and unconscious thoughts and beliefs much faster than before.
Yes, definitely.
So what can we actually do about this?
So this is where mindfulness practice becomes a really relevant part of our experience. We can definitely do something like not entertaining our fears, not indulging pessimistic thinking, and consciously focusing on what makes us happy and what fulfills us, rather than what we are worried about or what we are unhappy about in our lives. This becomes very relevant, and just to sort of backtrack, because I know that some of the concepts are quite abstract, it feeds into the cause and effect, into the polarization, and into the amplification of the energy within matter. So because of these three factors, our thoughts are becoming more and more important in terms of how we live our lives, what we attract. So we'll get into the laws of attraction in podcast number 4, after we've dealt with the self. And then that will also make a bit more sense. You know, the like attract like, and also the properties of the energy within matter comes into play there in terms of coherence and incoherence. And this actually influences directly what we attract into our world. So if the properties of the energy within the matter of our physical body is incoherent, we'll attract more incoherent circumstances. And if the properties of the energy, so the consciousness within the matter of our bodies, is more coherent and balanced, we'll attract more coherent circumstances.
So in the last episode you spoke of mass, coherence and oscillation frequency. How does one actually increase the coherence and the oscillation frequency? And would one actually increase the mass?
Okay, so energy flows where focus goes. Okay? This is a very strong metaphysical principle, but there are various scientific experiments that also actually, specifically quantum physics experiments, that focus on the outcome of experiments that actually confirms this. So what we can, of the three, so of oscillation frequency, coherence, and mass, the one that is the most easiest to increase is coherence. And it is as simple as listening to music that is harmonious and balanced. It's focusing on nature, and it is thinking about things that make us happy and fulfill us, and that we find beautiful and that inspire us. So simply by focusing on this, we already attune our energy to be more coherent. Okay? Interestingly enough, but not exclusive to this, making our energy or our thoughts more coherent automatically increases our oscillation frequency. Okay? And this is a very important distinction, because heightened experience can also increase our oscillation frequency. That's literally a double-sided coin. Okay? And this is why it is so important to mindfully practice coherent thought.
And this is probably fairly simple, because you can do this through meditation or spending time in nature and doing things that you enjoy, and you would quite naturally start increasing your coherence and your oscillation frequency.
Mass at this stage doesn't specifically come into play for us as humans, because our mass basically is what it is. There are as many subatomic particles of our body together as there is together in a body, and that stays fairly constant. Where it comes into play is the deeper we move into the photon belt, the more the mass of the photons present in that belt increases. And therefore the amplification and the intensification of our own thoughts and feelings, so the energy within our matter increases.
So we would have more photons within our body as we move
us.
deeper into this photon belt.
Yeah, so that radiation will increase because there's more photons there and they're packed more densely together. And so the influence of that will increase on us. And that's where the mass comes in.
Okay. So do you have any examples or suggestions on exercises that people can do to help them with this process?
So in terms of increasing our coherence, which is the first and the easiest thing that we can do, one of the things that I suggest is for people to think about what makes them happy and what fulfills them before going to sleep at night and when they wake up first thing in the morning. You know, it's actually quite shocking and maybe worrying how many of us think about what we worry about before we fall asleep. And you can just imagine what an influence that has on the quality of our sleep and the depth of our recreation while we sleep and our restoration. So that is something that is very easy. It's just a conscious decision to think about what makes you happy. You know, if it's your pet, or if it's your child, or it's a success that you've had, or something that you find beautiful, and you keep your mind on that as you drift off into sleep. And then when you wake up in the morning, you try to recall what that thing was that you thought about the first when you went to sleep. And you try to recreate the experience of that again before you go into your day. The other thing is to actually invite coherence into your life. So through music that is musical and melodious and pleasing, as well as nature scenes and, interestingly enough, also nature sounds. To listen to this, say for 5 or 10 minutes at a time, and see how you feel and see how long that feeling lasts. And then think of something that upsets you or that you find disturbing or don't enjoy, and then see how you feel and how long that feeling lasts. And the interesting thing is that the things that we don't enjoy have low coherence and low oscillation frequency but high mass. And so they linger longer. And that's why you have this thing that it actually is harder work to focus on the positive. You see, and that's why mindfulness practice becomes so important.
Yeah, this all sort of makes a lot of sense to me, because when I was going through the stage of transforming my career, where I'd say that the work that I was doing perhaps had low coherence and low oscillation frequency, pulling myself out of there, what I was naturally drawn to do was things like walking in nature or listening to music. You know, and I can still remember the sort of playlists that I'd listen to try and raise my coherence and my oscillation frequency.
Exactly. There is an added factor there, and we'll also get into that sort of deeper into the podcast, but if you look at what we spoke about originally, which is the oscillation frequency of inanimate matter being 7.8, the oscillation frequency of humans sits around 8.6, which is relatively low if you speak of the nature of consciousness and coherence. So if you look at nature and you look at the oscillation frequency of subatomic particles of nature and nature sounds, it's all above 9. It sits around 9.5. Okay, so there's quite a gap there. And so what you find is that the bulk of humanity sits in low coherence and low mass.
So we're kind of sitting between the sounds of nature and a table.
You could say that, Mark, although unfortunately part of the reason why the bulk of humanity's coherence is so low is because they experience suffering.
Yeah.
They experience themselves to be in suffering and they are identified with that suffering. And we'll get more into that in our next podcast when we talk about the self. But there are reasons for that, and that's where 2020 is so exciting to me, because it's a first opportunity to start disidentifying with that model of suffering and to start understanding that there is another way. Yeah. And there is another way of experiencing life on earth.
And I suppose, given that a lot of our time is spent interacting with other human beings, if we can raise the oscillation frequency and the coherence of all humanity, it would help us in turn to raise our own.
Definitely, and there is also a phenomenon which we get into podcast 4 and 5, which is called the collective subconscious. And that is the idea that sort of all is one and one is all, that we're all connected on some level. One of the easiest ways for me to explain that, just as a bit of an introduction, is experiments that they've done with mathematical problems. And what they've basically found is that when a mathematical problem is solved, every time it's solved, it gets solved easier in other places around the world, unrelated to the person that actually solved it originally. They also saw that with the phenomenon of the Rubik's Cube. I don't know if you know the Rubik's Cube, that you have to move and get all the colors and all the different signs. So they found that initially when the Rubik's Cube came out, it took a very long time for people to solve the Rubik's Cube. But the more and more people that solved it, the quicker new people actually managed to do that.
Yes.
And they take this to some kind of connection that is between all of us or amongst all of us. And that is called the collective subconscious. So a lot of our incoherent thoughts sit in our subconscious and is, in my view, certainly related to unresolved trauma. So there we're going to look at the self, and we're going to look at how to work with that unresolved trauma and to what we call clear it. And we find that the more clear our subconscious is of unresolved trauma, the easier it is to increase our coherence, our oscillation frequency.
Thank you very much, Yvette. That was very enlightening, and I look forward to chatting again for episode 3.
Great, thank you, Mark.